This is the Plant Yourself podcast. I'm Howard Jacobson of plantyourself.com, the Big Change Program with Josh Lajani, and WellStart Health. This podcast is part of my mission to help you live a conscious and compassionate life. All right, let's get right to today's episode. There are days when to myself, I grumble about having to do this podcast, when there's a lot of editing to be done, when I have to turn my typo notes into coherent show notes, when my audio sounds terrible and I have no idea why. And then there are days like this when I get to share with you an interview with one of my action heroes. And you'll hear during the interview, I was kind of nervous and fanboyish and just about trembling with the excitement and privilege of interviewing Safina. Carl is the author of a bunch of really important and beautiful books, most recently, Beyond Words, What Animals Think and Feel. I first heard it on Audible a couple of years ago. Carl was the reader as well as the author, and I was utterly mesmerized and transformed by the listening. And I think that it was one of the sneaky factors that pushed me, somewhat against my better judgment, into an alliance with the animal welfare camp of the plant-based movement. I was really kicking and screaming to just talk about health. The book, Beyond Words, describes Safina's encounters with three fascinating and endangered animal populations: the elephants of East Africa, the wolves of Yellowstone, and the orcas of the Pacific Northwest, and the humans who have devoted their lives to studying, documenting, understanding, and protecting these magnificent creatures. The central idea of Beyond Words is something that I did not realize was so controversial in scientific circles. It seems fairly straightforward to me, and that is that animals have thoughts and feelings and are in every way the moral equals of human beings. This is not going to surprise any dog owner, but it flies in the face of 200 years of reductionist, materialistic science that relegates animals to it status. They're basically interchangeable units without cognition or consciousness. And that viewpoint is what allows us to commit atrocities, such as elephant poaching for tusks, wolf killing for sport, and turning the ocean into a bad neighborhood unable to sustain life. I'm so excited to bring this interview to you. And so, without further ado, Safina, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
So I wanted to talk with you about your 2015 book, Beyond Words. And it's essentially about a lot of things, but sort of the broad plot line is about three very different types of animals and how they're doing out in the wild and interacting with humans, and I'm curious, just from a big picture perspective, what were you trying to understand or convey to your fellow humans when you set out to write the book, before you actually got into the experiences and the reporting?
Yeah, I wanted to show who we are in the world with. Who besides human beings, what other beings we are here with. And most people are really very unfamiliar with other animals and how they live, what they think about, what they feel, what their lives are like. They may know the names of species. They may hear something about their conservation status or where you might go to see them. But they don't really understand a lot about their lives, because it takes a long time to do that.
And why is that important to us? Because I'll just say that after I first didn't read it, I listened to it on Audible, and it was I'm glad I did, because it was kind of an enforced slower experience. I couldn't cheat again. And I felt like at the end of listening to it, and this was about 2 years ago, I was changed. And in preparing for this conversation, I reread it, and there were a lot of things that I hadn't remembered. And I did feel changed in some, really interesting ways. I'm wondering
Well, I think
what you were hoping.
You just answered your own question, really, in a way. Is that's why it's important to know these things, because there's a lot going on in the world that if we understood it, we would be different, and we would think different, we would act different, we would value things differently. And the main reason that's important, unfortunately, is because we're destroying so much of the world. So, yeah, that's the answer, I think.
Right. So near the beginning of the book, you talk about that you started out by saying how are they like us, and what can they teach us about ourselves, meaning the animals. And you say, what I don't see coming is I have the question almost exactly backwards. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, some people study animals hoping that they will give us insights into ourselves and into the human mind and the human condition. And what we really need to know is about their minds and their condition. It's not always about us. Not everything in the world has value or is fascinating, depending on us. These creatures are here. They have as much of a claim to existence as we do. And just instead of asking what can we learn about ourselves from them, it's the more interesting question is what can we learn about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm thinking of the anecdote when you were talking about having the wolf sort of look, and you said it didn't actually look through me; it just sort of looked past me, like I wasn't that interesting, right? Like
I was
like something that wasn't really food.
Right. Some people say, "Oh, the wolf looked right through me," as though there again, I'm the most important thing, and the wolf is so fascinated about me, and it's seeing my soul and all these kinds of things. But the feeling I had was it really wasn't interested in me. I didn't mean anything to that wolf, and I think that's appropriate.
Right. It's. I'm reminded of a song by Greg Brown where he's talking about like the chickens. I think he's referring to a Neruda poem actually, that the chickens look at us like we're not that important. He says,
mm-hmm.
and they do, and we aren't, but it's hard to take from a damn chicken.
Yeah. Right. Right.
It can feel. I guess there's a way in which humans can feel sort of insulted by the fact that we're not the measure of all things.
Well, that's one of the main problems with us is, we have these incredible egos with this incredible insecurity that goes along with it. And we are capable of being insulted by the way the world is. That's a little bit psychotic, really.
Right, and one of the things that struck me is about in the descriptions of all these different animals who are highly social, highly intelligent, is how unpsychotic they are up to the point where they can't take us anymore.
Yeah, yes, that's true. I mean, one of the things about non-humans is that they're very sane. Most of the things that we see in ourselves, we can see some of that in other animals, almost everything. But the things that I don't see in other animals are some of the least flattering things about ourselves. Things like self-loathing and depression and being suicidal. And these tremendous psychological illnesses. Other animals seem to be much better adjusted to life and the world than we are, unless humans abuse them. That's, I think, the only time you see animals that seem depressed is basically when humans are imprisoning them.
Right. Well,
The rest of the time, animals are great pragmatists. They're very rational beings. They only believe what there is evidence for, and they don't kill each other over ideologies or you believe in one kind of God, I believe in another kind of God. Now I will kill you. Those kinds of things only humans do.
Right. You have a line that you say, I think you're talking about the wolves, like they know what their lives are about. And
yeah,
it just struck me that, like I can read this and feel superior to the hunting interests and the whaling interests and but I can't feel superior to animals who know what their lives are about, because I was thinking about it, like, I really don't know what my life is about.
Uh-huh. Well, that's pretty interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'd like to the other thing that I just wanted to get into before we speak about the extraordinary stories of the animals themselves is I was actually having trouble when I was listening to the book, hearing you talk about sort of the way modern science tries to look at animals and explain them in a very reductionist, silly way. And I didn't know your work before that, so I had no basis for judgment. But it felt like you're sort of creating a straw man out of science. Then when I was reading through the footnotes of this book, I realized, if anything, you were being kind, and it was really hard for me to accept that scientists who study animals can be so clueless about animals. Can you talk a little bit about what you discovered and what the state of the art is, or
sure.
sort of the mainstream around understanding animals?
Yeah. Let me walk that back a little before I take it forward, and that is to say, for one thing, I am a scientist. I have a PhD in ecology, and I've studied seabirds and written articles in science journals, peer-reviewed journals, quite a lot of articles about that kind of research. Secondly, I think that science is the greatest thing that the human mind has ever created, because it's really the only endeavor that is designed to try to find out what's really going on, and it's the only thing that people do where, built into the process, you can say, oops, I got that wrong. Now I believe something different based on the evidence. And where the standard of evidence is, it exists, everyone can see it, and you have to believe what the evidence shows, regardless of whether you like the evidence, whether you wish it wasn't happening. Things like climate change, let's say, the evidence is that people are changing the climate. I wish it wasn't happening, but I have to believe it because the evidence shows me that it's going on, whether I like it or not. So science is very powerful, and I, as a scientist, hold it in very high esteem. The only problem is that science is done by people, and people are very imperfect. So while there is a lot of very good and very insightful science about other animals, about non-humans, there is also some ridiculous science about non-humans. And the main fork in that road is that there are a lot of people who study animals in the wild, and they are really tuned into them and what's going on in the bigger picture. And I think that they have found out and learned a tremendous amount. Just for one well-known example is how Jane Goodall, one of the first people who went to study a species where it lives, doing what it's supposed to be doing, she came under just withering criticism from old male colleagues who had never been in the field and didn't know what she was seeing, and really did not have a good reason to be critical of her, and turned out to be quite wrong. So the field people, in my experience, they tend to be very, very widely knowledgeable and very insightful because of it. They have perspective, they have the context, they get it. Then there are a bunch of other people who they study animals in very artificial captive situations. And some of those are good and insightful, and you can learn some important things, and others are just totally absurd. And in addition to being absurd, they come out with very, very strange impressions about what animals do and don't do and can and cannot do.
Right. So you make the argument that we share almost all of our evolutionary equipment with other species. Right.
Well, we do. I mean, I don't make the argument. That's just simply a fact. We simply do.
Right, but you marshal that fact to say, like, why would it be crazy to think that dogs or elephants or wolves can feel the things that we would consider as human emotions, right? Like, I didn't know the literature, so I didn't realize that there was such a taboo on saying, like, the elephant turned to protect its young, rather than the elephant turned to interpose itself between its young and the Jeep. Like, you're allowed to say the second one, but you're not allowed to infer any kind of motivation.
Well, in the way you stated the second one, you implied motivation. The way that those people who have this taboo would say it is the elephant positioned herself between the baby and the Jeep without saying why she did that. Not that she went to get between them, but that she simply, that's where she was, now that's where she is. And that's all you're allowed to say. But that, that is, it's just nonsensical to, well, science is not supposed to have rules like that. For one thing, you're supposed to believe things based on the evidence. If the evidence is that she is protecting her baby, you should be allowed to say that. Now, basically, all the field scientists would simply say that because it's obvious. But there is this substantial, although weakening, contingent of scientists who would say, no, you're not allowed to do that. When I was in college, the vast majority of people who studied animals studied them in captive settings, and they did have these rules, and I was taught those rules, and I thought, okay, well, those are the rules. I think it's good to start out by not believing that the elephant is trying to protect her baby, or that she isn't trying to protect her baby. Let's just see what she does. But then when you see what she does, then you ask, well, why did she do that? And then you realize that, all of the evidence is she protects her baby. That's how she's responding. That's the result. In everything else that she and her entire family do, they're very protective, they're very careful, they're very attentive to the baby, and the baby lives instead of getting hit by the Jeep, let's say. So isn't it therefore obvious and inescapable that she protected her baby? What in the world is what do we lose by acknowledging something that is so basic?
So do you feel you had to change coming out of grad school? That you had to have experiences that shook that set of rules?
Well, I'm not big on rules to begin with. So, when I was taught that, I thought, okay, well, I understand the rationale for it, but there was always this but. Let's just see what seems to be going on, kind of a thing. And all through my life, ever since I was really quite small, I was observing wild animals in various contexts, and captive animals. As I mentioned in the beginning of the book, starting from the time I was 7 years old, I used to breed homing pigeons, and I was very, very intimately acquainted with their lives. And it just before anybody told me what I could and couldn't believe, it just was obvious to me that their lives had many parallels with ours, that they paired up, they sometimes argued, sometimes the different couples fought over territory or shoved each other away from the food or got along well, and they took good care of their babies, and their lives revolved around raising their babies. And, like right across the yard, we lived in our apartment building, where we were living in stacks of boxes, just like the pigeons in the coop were living in stacks of boxes. And the parallels were pretty clear, pretty obvious. And even after being told about how wrong I was and reevaluating all of that, I decided I don't really think I'm wrong about this. So, luckily in graduate school, I had an advisor who was not a stickler for those kinds of things. She was a real excellent field biologist, and to her, things like intentionality and awareness and responding appropriately for appropriate reasons were not issues for her. If an animal got frightened and ran away, she didn't hesitate to say the animal was frightened. Whereas if you had the taboo in mind, the only thing you were allowed to say is the animal increased the distance between itself and the stimulus. But we were not afraid to say that the animal got scared and ran away.
Right. So has some of the change come about because of advances in sort of neuroscience and
yes,
sort of the ability
absolutely.
to map our brains?
Neuroscience and field science both are completely different than they were 60 years ago, when people first said, okay, we're going to take animal behavior from a bunch of old tales and fables and mythology, and we're going to make a science out of it. So we're going to wipe the slate. And those people were really quite brilliant. But since then, we've had many thousands of people go into the field to study animals in the wild, and we've learned almost everything we really know about how the brain works, not simply what it looks like when you slice it open, but how it works. We've learned, in about the last 50 or 60 years or so. And many of the people, the science of studying wild animals is very new. Most of the people who have ever studied wild animals, in any major way, they're still working. Jane Goodall is still working, and Ian Douglas Hamilton, who was the first person to study elephants without killing them, is still working, and George Schaller is still working, and some of these early pioneers, they're around. I've met them, so it's new. It's not a thing that we have centuries of history thinking that way.
Right. So I'd like to talk about the elephants, and can you tell us how you decided to go to this particular reserve and what you found there?
Yeah, well, I decided, I went to two reserves, actually, Amboseli and Samburu. Most of the material in the book comes from Amboseli. Some of it comes from Samburu. And I went there because the most knowledgeable people were there, and the populations were completely protected legally, although not in fact. And I wanted to go to protected populations because I wanted to see just what they are like when they're just being themselves and when they don't have to deal with people too much. Unfortunately, what I found was that they had to deal with people a lot, and that people were exerting mortal pressure on them all the time. We had this truly horrific, nightmarish poaching crisis right now, and it was absolutely at the height of how it was raging when I was there. And in Samburu, they were losing an elephant a day to poachers. Every day another elephant was killed. And that population there, I think at that time, was about 600 elephants. It was very, very disturbing, to say the least, to go to a place where you think it's as protected as anywhere in the world and find out that they're just being shot every night.
And, I had known about the poaching crisis intellectually and seen statistics, but after Beyond Words, it became very personal. So, knowing that Echo and Enid and Tim were, as you say, were who's, not what's.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a story about an elephant that folks who are listening can maybe get a glimpse of that before they rush out and get their own copy?
Well, of course, I'd rather that they rush out and get their own copy before we're even done with this interview. But
right. Well, that's what we're doing here, right?
There are many stories. I think the most famous of those elephants is probably Echo, because she was pretty extraordinary, and her family was filmed by the BBC at a particularly interesting and amazing time. And you can look her up online, and you can see lots of fragments of this documentary, or watch the whole documentary, which is called Echo of the Elephants, and see that she was known as a very wise leader of her family. Elephants live in these family groups where all the females stay together for their entire lives. They never leave their mother, and they never leave their sisters. The males do leave when they get to be adolescent, but the females stay together, and Echo was very level and very smart about things. She guided them through and around different crises, such as droughts and things like that. And at one point in the documentary, and in her life, but the amazing thing is that this actually was recorded on film, she gave birth to a baby that could not straighten out his front legs, and he could not stand up, which meant he couldn't really reach her nipples to nurse, and he couldn't walk. And they're supposed to stand up more or less right away, nurse, and follow the family around while the family is foraging. And the people in the park, the officials, they have a policy about not interfering and not killing animals, but they were considering making an exception because this baby seemed to be really suffering and struggling, and they thought that with him trying to hobble around on the backs of his wrists, he would soon develop sores and infections and die a miserable death. But instead what happened was they did not interfere, and Echo and her entire family constantly waited for him, and they would take a few steps and they would wait for him to catch up, and she would kneel down so he could nurse. And they, in a sense, they sort of kept the faith there with him. They certainly adjusted everything about themselves to try to let him survive and keep him alive. And in not too terribly long, I forget how many days it was, but it wasn't weeks. He started to straighten out the front legs a bit, and then he sort of in a way figured out that if he could get his front feet flat on the ground, even though his legs were bent, if he could get the front feet flat on the ground and raise the back of his body, it would kind of force his legs to straighten out. And that's what he did one day. And that was when he started walking more or less normally, and then he became okay.
Right, and there's so much in there to unpack. But part of it is, you write that elephants have to learn how to be elephants, and
Right,
it
right.
sounds like this young fella was like figured it out maybe by observing. I mean, we can't know, right? But maybe by looking at everyone else the same way a baby elephant would take its trunk into another elephant's mouth. Like, what are you eating? Is this good? Is this safe? That it kind of there's a natural curiosity and mimicry
Well,
that
maybe.
taught.
I mean, he may have seen. He may have seen how he was supposed to be walking. He may have somehow understood that they are very intelligent in a lot of ways. They're extremely social. They pay a lot of attention to one another, and they have to be taught what is good to eat, as you alluded to. They often learn that by putting their trunk in their mother's mouth, and then they get a sniff and they get a taste, and of course they see what the mother is eating. And the other thing is that they don't know what's dangerous. They have to be taught to fear lions, for instance. So the learning process is long. It's comparable to being a human. They start maturing when they're about 12 years old, and the males don't start breeding until they're about 30 years old. So they live complicated lives with lots of family around, and other families of elephants, that some of whom they know very well, and others they know less well, but they know who is supposed to be around. And here's an example of a good, insightful experiment. Scientists recorded the voices of elephants of very different families in an area, and then they went hundreds of miles away and they recorded the sounds of elephants there. And when they played back the families from the local area, the local elephants they were playing those back to didn't do much, didn't respond much. But when they played the ones from hundreds of miles away, they immediately snapped to attention, because they knew instantly that these were strange elephants. They didn't know who this was. So that's an example of a very good experiment. I think that really teaches a lot.
Right. That humans can go. I can go in for a safari and spend a couple of days there, or just sort of glance out of the side of my consciousness and just apply a single label to all of them. Oh, they're elephants. Because I can't tell them apart and because I can't understand them, then they're interchangeable and unintelligible, or not. They don't have anything to say.
Yeah.
And yet, when when you talk
that's
about
true. One of the problems that we have is, part of our genius is that we have labels for everything, but part of the weakness of our intellect is that we have labels for everything, and we think that the label is the same thing as knowing what it is, and those two things are extremely different. So Cynthia Moss, the main researcher who I went to visit, she said that it took her 20 years to start to feel like she was understanding how the elephants were cueing on each other and who they were taking, when a cue was being given and what the cue was and what they were really doing. You don't get that in a couple of days. It takes a couple of decades to get that.
right. And so if someone goes there and spends a week or a month and doesn't see it, they can just say, well, you're making it up.
Well, they probably wouldn't even think that far about it. They'd probably say we went and saw elephants and it was great. But, as far as really seeing who they are and how they live, you wouldn't be able to just get that yourself. My way of cheating is I go with somebody who's been doing it for 40 years, and I spend a month sitting with them watching the elephants. And before I get there, I've read 700 pages of research from the 40 years of that study, and I'm pretty prepped when I arrive, and then I start learning everything. So that's my way of cheating. But compared to just going for a couple of days, it's a different experience, and I'm very, very lucky that I can do things like that.
Right. I mean, one of the things that really struck me was when you gave us the thought experiment about imagining a researcher from another planet trying to describe human communication. I took it farther in my terror-addled brain. I think I've been watching too much Black Mirror, and I imagined them coming down and trying to decide if we were sentient, if we were ethical, right? And they couldn't understand our language.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
That I would certainly not want to be treated intellectually the way we treat animals that we don't understand.
No, you wouldn't. That's true. That's certainly true.
So, and also related to the story of Echo, one of the things I learned from Beyond Words is the damage that can be done to an entire elephant grouping or society when a long-lived matriarch is killed. So just, when I think about death in a very sort of actuarial way, I think, well, it's okay. The older ones are dying, because they have the least life left in them. But that's not how the calculus works with elephants, is it?
No, it's the way the calculus works with them is a lot like it works in your family. They really mean a lot to one another, and they basically live by following the older one who has the store of all the wisdom of the experience that she's had in a much longer life than all the other ones in her family. So, many people do think of it in an actuarial way where it's just numbers. It's just like counting marbles, but it's not that way to them. If their mother gets killed, their mother has been killed, and they are at a loss because not everybody is as knowledgeable, quite simply, about what to do. And some of them are not really cut out to lead. And in the case of Echo's family, Echo died of old age, hastened by a drought, but her oldest daughter, who should have succeeded her, did not inspire the confidence of the other daughters, and they didn't follow her. So that family started to fragment. A much worse fragmentation is in the section on the wolves in the book, mm-hmm. where the breeding female of that family gets killed, and the whole family starts to completely fall apart, and the siblings begin fighting with one another. The father is routed from his own territory by other wolves that come in as suitors to his daughters. It's a lot of stuff that you might see in a human family when a catastrophe like that happens, and it rearranges the trajectory of the lives of all the children. But we almost never think about anything like that for any non-humans. And I'm not saying that this happens to every other species, but there are a few that are very social, and the individuals are very important to one another. And those are the kinds of species that I chose to focus on. So elephants and wolves and certain kinds of whales like the orcas that I wrote about, they really exemplify that. And there are others that I didn't really focus on. Some of the apes, for instance. Yeah,
and I did feel like, the stories were tugging at my heartstrings, that I don't necessarily see the world or smell the world or hear the world the way these other creatures do, but the emotional apparatus that we share allowed me at least to believe that I was witnessing, I was in the presence of souls that were enduring and suffering joys and triumphs and all of life. I cried.
I think the key there is one thing that you said, the emotional apparatus that we share. The key is that, yes, we do share a fair amount, a considerable amount social and emotional apparatus with some of the other species that are here on the planet with us. That I think is really the key point, and it's one of the main things that I was trying to show.
Right. So let's move on to wolves, because those stories, I think there was sort of more sort of individual. It was more like Game of Thrones or Dallas or something that could really be a gripping narrative. Maybe start by talking about the wolf called 21.
Yeah, well, 21. The wolves are named in Yellowstone. They simply refer to the wolves by the number of their collar. Many of them, not all of them, are wearing collars that are put on by researchers. And 21 was one of the first pups to be born in Yellowstone after 60 years of absence, because the park had exterminated all the wolves, and all the rest of the wolves south of Canada had been exterminated by everybody else. So in the 90s, they brought a couple of dozen wolves in from Canada to try to reestablish them after 20 years of vicious political fighting about whether to do this or not. And he was one of the first pups to be born there. His father was shot almost immediately. And he always, from a young age, seemed to show that he was a very precocious, sort of talented little wolf. He just sort of always assumed a wolf-type leadership qualities, even within his own family. He was often first to do different things, and always seemed bolder. And he went on to have a pretty incredible career. He was called the Super Wolf by the researchers who were watching him every day. And he distinguished himself in two major ways. One is that he never lost a fight with another wolf. And wolves, unlike elephants, which almost never fight, wolves do fight over territory. And he had a lot of fights in his life, but he never lost a fight. And also, unlike almost any other wolf, in fact, I never heard this about any other wolf, he never killed a wolf that he had beaten in a fight. He always let them get up and go away. So both of those things are very, very unusual, probably completely unique. And he came into the world at a time when, because he was new in Yellowstone, or when the wolves were new, the elk and the deer populations had become extremely large and extremely dense, and were really out of balance. But that meant that the wolves had a lot of food, and that meant that there were many, many wolves there for a few years. And so his family, which we call a pack, but it's really a family of usually one mom and dad, and then their children of 2 or 3 years. And then when the children start maturing, they leave the family, just like in a human family. They live in a nuclear family, as we call it with humans. That's what a wolf pack is. But his got exceptionally large. It got to be almost 30 individuals. And yet he had what it took to keep all of that organized for quite a while, actually. And then he also died of natural causes.
Right. And when you wrote about his leadership abilities, it wasn't just tough guy, right?
No, that's one of the main misconceptions that people have about wolves, because we have this weird thing where we call people alpha males, and that is taken from the lexicon of how people used to talk about wolves, how researchers used to talk about wolves. They don't talk about them too much like that anymore, because they understand now that there's simply a breeder who is a male and a breeder who's a female, and those two are mates. And the reason that they are the leaders is that they're the mom and dad, and all the other ones look up to them. But our impression of an alpha male human is a tough guy, somebody who's always bossing everybody around, snarling about everything, and gets his way by bullying. But in an actual wolf family, that doesn't happen, because if you're constantly bullying and fighting with your children, you're not going to have much of a family. And if you don't have much of a family, you're not going to have much of a hunting unit, and then you won't do very well. So wolves depend on being together and cooperating, and they're very nice to one another. They're like dogs are in our own families, because dogs are descendants of wolves, and what they show us is what wolves show one another. They're friendly, they're cooperative, they're supportive, and the alpha male, who is, as I say, the breeding male, is someone who just leads by example, and often, especially in the case of this super wolf 21, who never lost a fight, he loved to just play with his pups, and when he played with his pups, he liked to make believe that he lost. So he would roll over on his back, and the pups would swarm all over him and jump at him and bite his fur and that kind of thing. He didn't need to show his pups who was boss. He didn't need to beat them when they were play fighting. He didn't need to do any of that kind of stuff. It seems to be only maladjusted human males who need to do that kind of stuff. What is that movie where there's that fantastic scene on the basketball court? Is that the Great Santini, or I can't remember quite the name of that movie, but that really shows a human father who has to beat his son, and how dysfunctional that is, and how damaging it is to the son that he's that way. And wolves are not that way.
Mm. And you write that one of the wolves, the 21 allowed to live, I think it was Casanova.
Yes.
He sounded like a real jerk. Like I would have had sympathy for 21 had he decided to end Casanova's life. But it turns out that through the daily observations by the wolf researchers that you spent time with, they discovered that Casanova later played a role in saving a considerable number of 21's offspring.
Yes. So another thing about most animals, and this is very illustrated by the wolves, is that you would think that they're all like I said, they're all just marbles. They're all the same, and they all like to do the same things. They all act the same. A wolf is like an animal who just hunts and fights, but some wolves don't like hunting that much, and they prefer to guard the young ones. They don't really like to go hunting very much. And most male wolves want to lead a family and have a mate. And this wolf Casanova was what his name implied. That's why he was named that. He was what you would call in a human very irresponsible. He was constantly looking for opportunities to sneak matings with female wolves, sort of outside the rules of wolf society. And he was to not only female wolves, but humans as well, an unusually attractive-looking wolf. And he was constantly a thorn in the side of 21. But later in life, as you alluded to, he kind of straightened out, shaped up, and took on the role of the lead male in his own pack. And the other thing that had characterized him early in life was he would often he was a very bad fighter, and in later life he became the opposite. He became a very responsible kind of, he really cared for the family, and part of his family were the direct descendants of 21, some of 21's grandchildren. And in one big fight that erupted with another pack of wolves, Casanova, he fought to the death, and that allowed the escape of the whole rest of his family. So this wolf that 21 could have killed but didn't kill, eventually is the reason that a number of 21's grandchildren survived. So, like I said in the book, there are lots of plot twists that nobody can see coming in their lives.
Mm-hmm. So the wolves in Yellowstone, they were welcomed back. I think there's some really interesting documentaries on how Yellowstone has changed for the better from all of the cascading effects of returning the apex predator. But it's not a happy story, right? There's been gutting of endangered species protections for the wolf, and the way you wrote about some of the way people on the internet and people met in bars talked about the wolves, it seemed so viciously racist. And you wrote
it's a kind of hatred that feels like racial hatred to me. It's irrational. It has nothing to do with how the wolves really are or what the wolves really do. It gets wrapped up in political ideology. There were people complaining about these are Obama's wolves, these are the liberals' wolves, and all this kind of stuff that is really kooky, but it's very dangerous also. And it is in ascendancy now, like a lot of kooky, dangerous stuff is. And so many of the protections of these species that were very hard won over many years are just getting the legs knocked out from under them. And a lot of wolves are getting shot. A lot of terrible things are happening with regard to the environment and protections for wildlife right now. I find it rather heartbreaking, actually.
Yeah, and I think we're almost to the point of wrapping up the very generous amount of time you've given me. But the tagline on your website includes the words inspiration and hope, and I was wondering where you are, because like my basic response to the book was one of grief. And you write, in terms of the elephants, that grief is a response to loss. And it's like you showed me these worlds. You showed me these beautiful individuals, against whom I did measure myself and came up short time after time. And in the stories of the way humans are being in the world, it's, there's these creatures and these civilizations of non-us are slipping away. And I'm wondering, is there hope and inspiration right now?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is grief, and many people who work on these things feel this way. There's a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, but the point is that nothing has ever been done by people who shrank away from the challenges, and the entire environmental movement, the entire conservation movement, has always been done against the odds, and it made a tremendous amount of progress. And right now, it is in retreat. But all of the colleagues that I know who are working on these things are all still working on these things. It's not a happy time to be working on them, but it's a much more important time to be working on them than when everybody on our side is winning. So. I think that my definition of hope is the ability to see how things can be better. If you can't see how they can be better, I don't think you can have hope. And inspiration to me is the urge to act. So you can have hope and you can be inspired even in times that are not the happiest times. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And in addition, the animals themselves are very inspiring because they're very, very worth it. They need their advocates. They need their human advocates nowadays, and they're really, really well worth it.
So when I gifted this book to my martial arts instructor, I told him, P.S. middle of page 153. And what I got from there was Doug Smith, one of the wolf researchers, who said, wolves never feel sorry for themselves. It's never poor me. They're always forward. Their next question is always next. I thought, wow, that's kind of us, who care about animals and who care about
right.
the world and who care about humans.
Isn't that a great way to let the wolves themselves inspire us to be better?
Yeah, because it's so easy to feel sorry for ourselves in these crazy times, and seeing, so there's so much about the world that a terrible administration can do, but we can recover from. But it seems like there's things going on now that we're sort of taking a last stand.
Well, I don't think the last stand analysis is right for most things. What I told our daughter when the election catastrophe happened and she was extremely upset, I said, well, let me try to tell you two things from my longer experience. One is that bad presidents do bad things, and they are harmful, but then we get somebody else and things change. And in the middle of that, we can also try to make as much change as we can try to make. So, it may seem black and it may seem bleak, but there's a longer game.
Right. And, you're right. People can change, but is there enough time? Right. So I think, maybe you just answered the question. It's like, it's not the second question isn't a question that we have the luxury of even thinking about. We just need to roll up our sleeves and do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you're on a sports team and you're losing the game, you don't just stop playing. You try to win until the end. So that's how I see it anyway.
Right. So one last set of questions. In addition to buying Beyond Words and checking out all of your other work, are there organizations that you think people should get involved with, should donate money to? How can the person who's not professionally involved in this work get started?
Yeah, well, I do think that the best way to be involved for people who don't have much time or not going to do it professionally is to support some groups whose work they like. In the end of the book, I listed some of the groups that were involved directly in the work that I was writing about, or at least trying to conserve the animals I was writing about. The Yellowstone Foundation, the Center for Whale Research, Save the Elephants, the Ambaselli Trust. I listed them in there, but there are many groups. I myself give end of the year contributions to probably 20 groups, and there are hundreds. So it depends on what you like. Some people like the really big national groups. Some people like the smaller local groups. It's easier to get involved personally with smaller local groups sometimes. So there are a few really good ones. I like the Natural Resources Defense Council. I like the Center for Biological Diversity. The other groups that I mentioned, and as I said, there are lots of other groups that everybody's got in their local area. They've got some people who are trying to do what you would like to see done. So they all need support, and they're all worth supporting.
Great. Okay, and I'll list a few of those in the show notes, and of course a link to get the book. Where can people find out more about you on the web?
On the web, it's either carlsafina.org or the safinacenter.org. That's my not-for-profit group. And I write various things that are sprinkled over in various places. I write on the National Geographic blog site. I write at Medium. That's another blog. I occasionally write in the New York Times and a few other things. So CNN.com is another one. I'm around. I'm easy to locate.
Great. So I hope everyone who's listening will check you out. We'll check out the resources that we talked about. and get a copy of this book. It's a it's a love story to a world that we can still protect and still have around for our children. So, Carl, I was so happy when I got your email saying you agreed to this interview, and I'm just so touched by your work and so thrilled to have had this conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm absolutely honored, and it's been a delightful conversation, and I really thank you for including me in it.
All right. Well, be well. Go from strength to strength, and
yes,
let's do it for the animals.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. If you enjoyed this episode of the Plant Yourself podcast, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. It really helps our mission to reach more people. For more information about the Big Change Program, led by me and Josh Lajani, visit bigchangeprogram.com, and be sure to check out the show notes for today's episode with links to everything we talked about at plantyourself.com/256. If you're new to the show, you can catch up on 255 archived episodes over at plantyourself.com, where you can also sign up for my weekly-ish newsletter, The Big Change Bulldog. Other ways to support the show include sharing this and other episodes on social media and becoming a patron of the show with an ongoing contribution. And you can do that over at plantyourself.com. Just click on the Patreon link on the right, or you can go to Patreon, patreon.com/plantyourself. You can check out the different statuses. And when you do that, you also get access to 3 Healthy Habit Huddles every single month just for patrons. In garden news, I hauled about 25 cartloads of wood chips from the front into the back garden, where I covered up not just the paths, but also the beds themselves with about 3 to 5 inches of pretty well seasoned wood chips, about 9 to 12 months old. And the principle is I'm going to take out little divots of wood chips, replace it with some really good soil, and then plant seeds directly into that soil. So instead of needing huge amounts of topsoil or compost, I can just get by with a bag or two of Happy Frog, put that into the wood chips, and then grow from that medium. And over time, of course, the wood chips will break down more and more. The 3 to 6 inches of mulch keeps down weeds and holds moisture. And so we're trying this new method. We did it last year just with beans. We had a really nice bean harvest. So for this spring, summer, and fall, we're going to try to plant in 3 to 6 inches of wood chips with a little bit of soil just around each seed. I'm very excited to see how that works. In running news, not that much going on. I'm preparing for my marathon next month, and I'm back up to about 25 miles a week. Still a little tweaky, but getting better, and I look forward to finding a fun, challenging ultra race in the fall. I think something with some technical trails and elevation to keep me motivated throughout the summer. All right, time to get gratitudinous. Thanks to Will Ridenauer for allowing me to use Stabali Dawn, the Dance of Peace, as this podcast's theme music. Check out willridenauer.com for more of his stuff. If you like it, why not make a purchase? That will make me feel better about using his music for all these episodes. And thanks to all you Plant Yourself podcast patrons. Let's do it. Kim Harrison, Lynn McClellan, Anthony Disson, Brittany Porter, Dominic Marrow, Barbara Whitney, Tanny Black, Amy Good, Amanda Hatherley, Mary Jane Wheeler, Ellen Kennelly, Melissa Cobb, Rachel Burns, Christine Nielsen, Tina Sharf, Tina Ahern, Jen Volkanovsky, David Bizek, the mysterious Michelle X, Elspeth Feldman, Victoria Dolo, Anova, Leah Stoller, Alan Christensen, Colleen Peck, Michelle Andrew, Josina, Julianne Rowland, Stu Dolnick, Sarah Durkis, Rhonda Circus, Kelly Cameron, Wayne Pedersen, Leanne Peterson, Janet Selby, Claire Adams, Tom Franzek, Jeanette Bedham, Gil Sarah, David Donahue, Blair Cyber, Dorona Vizov, Gio and Carolyn Argentati, Jody Friesner, Ruth Ann Funderburg, Misha Rosen, Michael Warbeck, the equally mysterious Tracy Z, Alicia Lemus, Rebecca Hughes, Val Linneman, Rise with Cinnamon, Nick Harper, Stephanie Holmes, Martha Bergner, Nicole Ramsey, Susan Ahmad, Molly Levine, Inscrutable Harry R., Susan Laverty, The Panda Vegan, Craig Kovic, Adam Sharf, Karen Burry, Heather Morgan, Ashley Corcoran, Kelly Machia, Diane Norton, Bonnie Lynch of Plant Happy Oregon, Sabine Kurtzels, Nigel Davies, Marion Blum, Teresa Copel, Shell Ruthless, Julian Watkins, Breed O'Connell, Brian Sheridan, Shannon Frischman, Kate Rolls, Linda Ayat, Julie Langholm, Hedegard, Isa Tuzin, Wakani, Hainline, Aaron Greer, Alicia Davis, Aviva Lyle, Heather O'Connor, Carolyn Jensen, Sherry Orlikowski of Plant Powered for Health, Karen Smith, Scott Marani, Karen and Joe Crabtree, Tanya Lewis, Kirby Burton, Teresa Carell, Kevin Kevin, I can almost... Kevin McCauley, for your generous support of the podcast. That's it for this week. As always, be well, my friends.